Good morning, everybody. So once again today, we are taking up the next gate in the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. So again, this is a text which shows up as the 11th fascicle of the 12th fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. It's mostly a long quote from another text called The Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So Dogen included this, or he found it important in his writings. He didn't write these 108 gates, they predate him. But somehow he thought they were important enough that he included them and wrote a bit of a comment or a couple of paragraphs at the end of this thing, sort of encouraging us to investigate these gates, to go through these gates and investigate them. So we are wrapping up a section of the text now that's describing the 37 constituent factors of Bodhi. So for the last several months, we've been taking these one at a time, these constituent factors of Bodhi, or factors of awakening. We are on the last grouping now, the 7 branches of the balanced truth. So we're about halfway through that group of 7. So gate 72 today. Entrustment as a part of the state of truth is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it conduct is already managed. So this is an interesting translation. I'm kind of a bit puzzled by the use of entrustment. This is the only translation I see with this entrustment, and as we see as we go along, other words get used in place of this word. So as a translation, I think it's a bit puzzling. There may be some subtlety in the Sanskrit or the Japanese or something of which I am not aware. But entrustment, I think, is an unusual translation. The original Sanskrit meaning, when we trace this all the way back in this gate, the original Sanskrit meaning here is calmness, or repose, or relaxation, tranquility, serenity, settledness, that kind of thing, as opposed to entrustment. So the idea in the early teachings was that one clears away or lets go of distraction and kind of mental effort and delusion and all of this kind of energy in order to develop tranquility. And that's happening both on a physical level and on a mental level. So physically there is settling down, mentally there is settling down. So the idea is we're getting to some kind of place of calmness, serenity, something like that. When that happens, we're able to be flexible, right? We're not rigid, we're not stuck on one point of view. We're able to react or to respond perhaps in a flexible, kind of pliable way to what we're encountering. So this calmness is related to the last factor we looked at, which is enjoyment, right? That was the last of the 7, this group of 7 that we looked at. So when we have joy in the Dharma, or we have enjoyment, right, we relax, we settle down. We're not feeling threatened, we're not feeling rigid, we're feeling, some ability to sort of go with what's happening and to find that joy that arises in the Dharma. So buoyancy is mentioned again with regard to this gate. Last time buoyancy was mentioned, it shows up again here. So there's a certain amount of lightheartedness, there's a certain amount of just not being dragged down, not feeling stuck, not feeling heavy. So entrustment may be an interpretation of what happens when we relax and settle, right? We trust the Dharma, we trust the practice, we stop chasing after stuff, we stop agitating ourselves, getting entangled with things. So I can see that there's a little bit of a faith and trust, right, factor there. In any case, we refrain from anger, we refrain from excitement, we also act in the world with some kind of settledness, with some kind of calmness, right? We bring that with us as we move through the world doing our bodhisattva work. So it's not just an internal state for our own pleasure, and this is what's going to be an important theme today, right? This kind of settledness, this kind of tranquility is not about I feel good because I've dropped my personal stress level. I mean, that's there, right? But the bigger part of this is how do we move through the world? Do we do that from a place of tranquility or from a place of agitation? So in this stage of meditation, in these early teachings, we also achieve a balance between tranquility and insight. So there's a little bit of a balance here between stillness, tranquility, not moving around, and insight, which is a little bit active, right? We have some wisdom, we have some understanding. So later on, I'm going to suggest that it's not unrelated to, of course, the major theme of the Mahayana and to Uchiyama Roshi's sort of major life question on peace and progress. So in other words, stillness and activity are coming together. Somehow in this gate, we're looking at the intersection of stillness and activity. How do these two things arise together, and how do we hold both of them? So the second half of the gate statement says conduct is already managed, and you just think, well, what does that mean? It means to have accomplished what was to be done in order to get to liberation. So this is not about conduct like bad behavior, right? This is not about I'm managing my conduct because I'm not, going to be rude to somebody. This is very much about we've done what needs to be done in order to liberate beings, and that includes ourselves and others. So in other words, when we let go of distraction and delusion and all of that stuff and we reach a level of serenity, then we've already done what's necessary to get to nirvana, according to the early teachings. So for this section of the 108 gates, we've also been looking at Dogen's comments on these 37 factors of Bodhi. Of course, he has another fascicle in his Shobogenzo, which talks about these gates, these 37 gates, or these 37 factors of Bodhi. So in his comment on this gate, he says, elimination, and you notice it's elimination, not entrustment. Elimination as a limb of the truth is when being in oneself, not getting involved with oneself, and when being in the outside world, not getting involved with the outside world. It is me having got it, you not having got it. It is ardently expressing ourselves and going among alien beings, which is an interesting comment. So elimination here, again, rather than entrustment, you see why that's a particular interpretation when it comes to translating this thing. So here's how I read what he's saying, and you may have a different interpretation. But when I look at this comment, here's how I read it. So clearing away distraction, mental effort, agitation, getting to a place of calmness, settledness, tranquility, means we're not caught up in self-involvement to the exclusion of seeing others, seeing anything else, seeing anybody else. But we're also not being pulled off course by others. So we're not so involved that we're ignoring what's out here, circumstances, beings, whatever, but we're also not getting pulled off course by that. We're able to encounter and work with a diversity of other people with different viewpoints, different circumstances. We can appreciate the differences in practice experience, in life experience, in worldview, culture, whatever that means. And while doing that, in the midst of all of that, we are still clearly expressing Buddha nature the whole time, regardless of the circumstances. So that's where I think Dogen is going with this. I think a key point here is that calm does not mean inactive, right? So when we're talking about calmness, we're not talking about withdrawing from the world. We're not talking about sort of retreating into a cave, not moving, not growing, not doing anything, and simply protecting our peace of mind. Now, this should sound familiar, related to Uchiyama Roshi's teaching, right? So being settled doesn't mean being uninvolved. Doesn't mean we don't care. Doesn't mean we don't act. This is familiar territory because it relates to these two teachings that we keep hearing about all the time. So one is that the theme of the Mahayana is seeing one reality from two sides and expressing two sides in one action. So we've certainly heard that plenty. That's Hojo-san's sort of summary, right, of the theme of the Mahayana, which I think is a really helpful summary, right? Seeing one reality from two sides and expressing two sides in one action. And the other, of course, is Uchiyama Roshi's enduring question about how we balance peace and progress. So in other words, how do we maintain our peace of mind while still carrying out our responsibilities in society or in the world? And of course, for him, this was a big deal because he was seeing a lot of societal change. After World War II, he's seeing a lot of Western influence come in, a lot of progress, a lot of technological innovation, and it was arriving in a Japanese culture which for many centuries had been mostly quite serene. In some ways, not involved with the world beyond its borders. There was a lot of value placed on steadiness and serenity. And then all of a sudden, in comes all of this new influence. So it was a real life question, a real practice question for him. How do we balance what I shorthand as peace and progress? So this is not a linear thing, this cultivation of whatever we're cultivating, right? It's not a linear thing. We don't cultivate serenity and then go out in the world and do our bodhisattva work, right? We can't wait for someday I'm going to be able to perfectly manage my peace of mind, or someday I'm going to have something I don't have now, and so I'm not going to act in the world until I reach some kind of state, right? We know that's not the Bodhisattva way. Those aren't the vows that we take. So we don't wait to cultivate serenity and then, go out to do our Bodhisattva work with equanimity as a kind of a means to an end. Our activity in the world is a complete expression of Buddha nature, which is already calm and tranquil. It's been calm and tranquil from the beginning. So there's nothing there that we need to acquire. We simply need to get out of our own way in some cases. So in other words, this is not a teaching about stress reduction, as I said, aimed at sort of making us personally feel better for a little while. It's a description of reality. So the reality is calmness is here, tranquility is here, Buddha nature is here. We are already expressing all of those things. So how do we do that in a skillful, meaningful way? So this gate isn't telling us to let go of our rough edges and settle down so that we'll be people we like better or people that other people like better. It's likely that our own suffering will dissipate to some degree, if we can let go of the delusion and the roots of the delusion and the suffering that goes with all of that. Yes, probably we're going to feel better. We're probably going to have a little, less stress, a little more contentment. That's a good thing. We don't need to deny that. It's just that we know that personal kind of happiness is not the point of this teaching and not the point of the practice. It's not the main purpose of what this gate is about. So how do we manage stillness in the midst of activity? I think that's our sort of practice question that goes with this gate. How do we not get stuck in either self-involvement or the distractions of the world and everybody in the world? Dogen gives us some concrete examples in the Eihei Shingi, which is his regulations for being in the training temple. So, it's everything from how do we get up off the cushion to how do we use the bathroom to how do we cook a meal, right? So in this set of instructions, he becomes quite concrete. So there's, very specific, we do this and this and this, and here's how we move the body, and there's very specific instructions. So this is not one of those texts that's, up here being terribly abstract all the time. He gives us some quite concrete examples, I think, for managing or being in the middle of stillness and activity. So in one part of the Eihei Shingi, he says, monks in Zazen do not turn their heads to look and see who is entering or leaving. Going in or out, do not look at the backs of the people doing Zazen, but just lower your head and proceed. Do not walk with long strides, but advance your body together with your feet. Look at the ground about 6 feet straight in front of you and take half steps. Walking with unhurried calm is exquisite, almost like standing still. Do not slide your slippers noisily so as rudely to distract the assembly. Keep your hands together in shashu inside your sleeves. Do not droop your sleeves down alongside your legs. So he's being quite concrete here. You can imagine what he's talking about here is if in the middle of Zazen you need to get up and leave, like you got to use the bathroom, or you're going out to light the candles for the service or whatever it is that you're doing, be careful about how you get down off the ton and go out of the room. So you don't flap your arms around, you don't look around at who's there, you don't flop your slippers on the floor. And when you think about the context for this, in a Soto, the floor is typically like slate tile or concrete or something. It's hard. And in the Soto, we wear slippers until we get up on the ton, up on the platform, we wear slippers. So you put your slippers on. These are they're the kind of slippers that you slide your feet into. So you can imagine everyone walking around, the potential for flap, 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 right? So imagine a silent zendo, everyone sitting zazen, someone has to get down and they're flapping on their way out the door. He's saying, don't do that. There's actually a whole practice we have to learn about how do we walk in those flappy slippers and not make noise. And it's really an interesting mindfulness practice because it's not only about me, it's about what's the atmosphere that I'm creating, right? So there's this whole, you kind of have to learn how to do that, which is an interesting practice. Anyway, so this kind of instruction is quite typical, actually, for life in the training temple. Manage yourself so you don't make trouble for others is a big theme. Expressed and unexpressed. Manage yourself so that you're folding in and you're not sticking out and you're not making trouble or distraction or something for somebody else. In other words, you have to pay attention to your own body and mind. And you can't get enmeshed only in what others are doing and stop paying attention to what's happening here. How they're sitting, how they arrived in the zendo, whatever. At the same time, you can't ignore the impact that you're having on the rest of the community, because you're there, you're doing something, and it affects other people. So if you're flapping your slippers and waving your arms around on your way out to the bathroom, you're creating a distraction for a whole soda full of people who are sitting zazen. So I like this. I think this line is particularly nice. Walking with unhurried calm is exquisite, almost like standing still. Isn't that interesting? So we're moving through the world, but we're doing it in a very calm, settled, open, flexible way, almost as though we're standing still. So this is a mind we can bring to our kinhin practice, for instance. We're walking very slowly. It's almost like we're standing still. So we're walking with unhurried calm, zazen mind, and it's almost like we're standing still. So that's one place we can cultivate it, but can we do the same thing when we're walking the dog? Or, walking from the car into the shopping center, or up and down the stairs at work, or something, right? Can we walk with unhurried calm, almost like we're standing still? So this is how we ought to be moving around in the temple, particularly in the zendo. No matter what we're doing in here, I have to say, I used to get called down in the training temple quite regularly for running or for moving too quickly. There was someplace I had to get to, somebody needed something, I was behind. I mean, when you look at the schedule in the training temple, it's like you've got somewhere to be. Feels like every 10 minutes, you better be wearing the right thing, carrying the right thing, ready to do whatever it is. I regularly got called down for hurrying. I was not walking in a calm and unhurried way like I was standing still. And, part of my brain said, I need to get where I'm going because I have a responsibility once I get there. But the piece I wasn't paying attention to was, what was I doing to everybody around me? I was, agitating people. I was sort of raising the level of, excitement. Well, that's not what you do in a training temple. So there's some wisdom and compassion, right, that has to go with our bodhisattva work in the world. So zazen is a place to cultivate our ability to be both still and active, right, at the same time. We can start by paying attention to our tendency to judge and label what's happening in our hearts and minds when we're sitting zazen. There's a certain amount of activity there. There's a certain amount of agitation there. Something comes up. This is good for me. This is bad for me. I like this. I don't like this, right? That energy is kind of always there. If we decide that the point of zazen is to become still or peaceful, for me, then any kind of noise or distraction needs to be rejected, needs to be eliminated. Now I have this judging, labeling thing going on. I'm sitting here trying to become peaceful, and gosh darn it, there's a bird outside the window, or gosh darn it, the neighbor's dog is barking, and suddenly, right? There's something happening there. We can start in zazen with that very simple dynamic, which happens all the time, to begin to consider stillness and activity. What is that about? We know if we're waiting for the perfect circumstances, we will never practice. If we're waiting for the time when the dog isn't barking and the bird isn't singing and the refrigerator isn't humming, we're never going to practice. So we know perfect conditions are not a requirement here. We need to kind of let go of that as a yardstick. So anyone who's ever been in our zendo here knows frequently not quiet. This is not by any means a silent zendo. The family lives upstairs, there's traffic and sirens outside, the refrigerator in the kitchenette is making all kinds of noise, people are coughing, right? I mean, if we're waiting for some kind of perfect circumstances, when are we going to practice? Clearly not the approach we need to take here. So, if we needed absolute silence and absolute stillness, nobody would ever practice here. And yet we've been practicing here for close to 20 years. So fortunately, absolute silence in the room, not a requirement. I read somewhere, we ought to be able to practice in a bus station. We ought to be able to practice in a train station. It's not about that. It's about what's happening here. So Hojo-san says, our minds often seem busier than usual when we sit in a quiet place. In fact, our body and mind are busier and noisier in everyday life, but since our environment is also noisy, we don't notice the commotion inside ourselves. When we come to a quiet place, however, we hear even the smallest noise. When we sit in the zendo, we hear the sound of the clock. The sounds our bodies make coming from within us become more noticeable, and it seems that our mind is noisier than usual. I think that's a good sign of our practice. We hear this noise because our mind is beginning to calm down. Of course, we should let go of the internal noise. We should neither cling to nor try to escape from the noise. We should just be awake and let it go. Let all thoughts, feelings, and daydreams simply come and go freely. Everything is moving. Nothing stays forever. Just let everything be with you. So I want to share a few other things that Hojo-san has to say related to Zazen and see how they're connected to this gate. And then we'll look at a few other ways that we can practice with this kind of stillness activity, what's going on in this gate. So Hojo-san describes sitting sesshin, describes his experience of sitting sesshin. And he says, sometimes anger will come up. For any of us, anger will come up. But the person who triggered it and the incident that maybe triggered it are no longer there, and yet somehow the energy of anger is there. This has probably happened to all of us. We're sitting sesshin, we're sitting zazen, some kind of anger comes up. Well, we're not sitting in front of that person, and that incident may have happened 5 years ago, but somehow that energy, right, is still bubbling in there. So we sit there trying to figure out what happened, right? Why did she say that nasty thing to me? Here's what I'm going to do about it. There we go. We've left the room. During sesshin, we can't keep that up for 14 periods a day. One of the things we discover is we can go in to sesshin with a lot of preoccupation, a lot of stuff happening in the mind. Well, golly, you're sitting looking at the wall 14 periods a day. You just can't keep that energy up. You can't keep pushing that. It's tiring. You just get tired. Your body and mind get tired. Eventually we calm down. Eventually we see that anger is here, right? The anger is me. The anger is something that I'm doing. It's not something out there. It doesn't belong to the person who triggered this thing in me, whatever that is. The anger is inside me and I'm the one creating it. So when we start to settle, we get to see that. The dust starts to settle. Oh yeah, wait a minute. What's happening is happening here, right? It's nothing that's happening out there. So he says, feelings and thoughts always come from our own consciousness. They come up in Zazen. When we let go, we can let go, and that's okay. Zazen is a unique and precious practice. In the zendo, we can let go of everything. This is really liberation, not only from our daily lives, but also from the karmic consciousness created by our twisted karma. In Zazen, we are determined not to take action based on the thoughts coming and going. Therefore, we don't create new karma. This is what it means that in Zazen, we are liberated from our karma. So elsewhere, he says, whether the mind is busy or calm, we just keep letting go of whatever comes up. We keep the same posture through all mental conditions without being pulled this way or that, so there is no good or bad Zazen. Zazen is always Zazen. Maintaining the Zazen posture through all conditions is a very important part of our practice. Keeping this posture is, as Dogen says in Fukanza Zengi, the Dharma gate of peace and joy. That is its self-realization, the actualization of reality and practice. Yet if we cling to favorable conditions and try to avoid difficult conditions, we create the cycle of suffering, of samsara, within our Zazen practice. The cycle may begin if we seem to succeed in making our Zazen pleasurable. Although such success initially makes us happy, sooner or later conditions change and our success disappears, making us miserable. If we keep struggling, our Zazen becomes a cycle of transmigration, shifting between realms of happiness and misery, and our practice is then no longer Buddha's practice. Now that's interesting. This last sentence here is interesting. So, if we're caught up in our own experience, inside our own heads, if we're preoccupied with what's going on out there, as opposed to what's in here, our practice is then no longer Buddha's practice. So in other words, it becomes harder to, as this gate statement, or as Dogen's comment says, ardently express ourselves, or ardently express our Buddha nature, and go among alien beings, right? So this is a kind of a interesting summary. If we're preoccupied here, our practice is no longer Buddha's practice, and it becomes very difficult for us to go out and express our Buddha nature. And as he says, go among alien beings. So ardently expressing our Buddha nature includes both the small self of these 5 skandhas and the universal self, that is just the universe doing what it does, right? The complete functioning of reality. So this is expressing 2 sides in one action. This is why I think this is tied to this major theme of the Mahayana. We're expressing 2 sides in one action. Like so many other areas of our practice lives, here we get to carry 2 things at the same time: form and emptiness, difference and sameness, stillness and activity. We get to live in that intersection of all of these things. So Sawaki Roshi has a great expression for this. He says, Zazen is to do what we cannot say and practice what we cannot think. Isn't that great? I mean, that's just such a wonderful summary. Zazen is to do what we cannot say and to practice what we cannot think. I think that's brilliant. I want a bumper sticker, you know? It's such a wonderful crystallization of our practice. So what a great restating, I think, of seeing one reality from two sides and expressing two sides from one action, right? We do what we cannot say and we practice what we cannot think. So Zazen is not about getting ourselves to a condition of equanimity or balance or serenity and then staying there. It's not like, well, I'm going to get to that place and then, you know, that's it. I'm just going to kind of stay in that place. We already know that's not the Bodhisattva life. That's not the Bodhisattva way. We don't ignore or suppress our karmic circumstances. We're in this human form. We have life experience. We live in certain ways. Our culture has handed us certain values, right? We have some karmic circumstances. We don't ignore that. We don't suppress that or think that that's somehow not good, not helpful. Instead, we see all of those things as a manifestation of Buddha nature, and we turn them around. We use them to liberate beings. If I've had a certain kind of suffering, I can understand your kind of suffering. If I speak a certain language, then I can connect with you in that language. You know, if I know how to sit and you know how to sit, we can sit together. Or I can teach you to sit if you don't know how, right? I mean, so there's all of these things we can use in our lives to help beings, ourselves and other beings, with their suffering. So we don't ignore this human form. We don't say, well, I want to leave this body in order to get to some higher plane. Well, I don't want to leave my life circumstances in order to get to nirvana. Well, A, not possible. B, not helpful, right? We need to use all of these things in our lives and turn them around. So Nishiyati Bokusan was a Dogen scholar in the last half of the 19th century. I have talked about him before. He has some very useful, interesting things to say. So here's something that he says I think is useful. If you stay in a place where enlightenment is finalized and going beyond is finalized, that is a dead thing. As soon as you have insight, you should remove your body from there and be engaged in the practice where each movement has essential clarity. Wow. So this is not only about impermanence. Well, we get some flash of insight and then in the next moment it's gone, because we know that happens. It's happened to all of us. But also, even if we get to some kind of state that we want to get to, we don't stay there. Because if we do, we're not paying attention to this, right? We're not using whatever we have and giving that to other beings. So if we get to some state and think, there, I've got it now, you know, even if it's really some kind of advanced understanding, according to him, that's a dead thing. That's really interesting, right? There's no energy there. Stuff stops moving. There's no life in that. It's like I got to a place, you know, I went into the cave and I'm like not coming out. That's not what we're doing here. It says, don't do that. That's a dead thing. I just think that's a really interesting way to put that. So, you know, maybe I think this state that I've got to is an achievement that I own, that I can enjoy, sort of keep for myself. As soon as I try to grasp it, of course, it's gone. I've lost it. It's just my idea of awakening or enlightenment or understanding or wisdom or compassion or whatever that is. It's just my idea of that rather than an actual dynamic living understanding, awakening, compassion, wisdom. It's just, you know, something I'm going to like grab and strangle the life out of. Well, you know, that's not what we're doing here, right? There's a certain amount of dynamism. So in the midst of stillness, there is still activity. So as soon as we have some insight, we need to get up and take it out into the world, according to Nishiyati Bokusan. We need to engage in practice where each movement has essential clarity. So in other words, where everything we do expresses Buddha nature. I think this is exactly the same thing that this comment is saying. Even how we get down off our seats and walk out of the zendo to go to the bathroom, if we think, you know, we only need to hold stillness and activity while we're in a practice place, we've missed the mark. This is something, yes, we're paying attention to in the zendo, but we're also paying attention to in the grocery store and the schoolroom and, you know, wherever, the workplace, wherever else we are. So we need to take that insight, take that understanding with us out of the zendo, off the cushion, out into the world. So Bokusan goes on to say, people today often lack this mindful practice, so they become retainers of devils. When we say that there is no out there in the Dharma Dhatu, then we cannot help but return to today. There is no higher thing that is to be feared, and there is no lower thing that is to be belittled. When we seek for the self and realize that the self is originally empty and serene, We need to make today's activities just today's. So if there's nothing outside of this moment, here and now, then we can't help but return to today, because today is all there is. So this is the only place we can act. This is the only time we can act. This is what we have, is today, this moment. So this is very much in line with the kind of things that Sawaki Roshi is teaching, right? There's, Zazen is good for nothing, because there's nothing outside of this moment of us doing Zazen. So we're not looking out here for some reward or some, achievement. In the midst of this moment, he says there's nothing higher and there's nothing lower. So there's nothing that's awesome and valuable that we need to chase after. There's also nothing unimportant and meaningless that we can sort of dismiss or be scornful of or belittle. We're right in the middle of all of that. So interestingly, Dogen makes a similar comment in the Eihei Koroku. So of course, Dogen precedes Nishiyata Bokusan. So, one may be reading the other, I don't know. But Dogen makes a similar comment. He says, when heaven has the way, it is high and clear. When the earth has the way, it is substantial and at rest. When people have the way, they are calm and peaceful. So we're living and practicing in the middle, right? In the intersection between high and low and heaven and earth and emptiness and form and sameness and difference and all that stuff. We're right in the middle. We're living in that intersection. So when we carry both of these things without discrimination, then we're calm and peaceful. And we can respond skillfully to whatever we encounter. So, when we're between heaven and earth, between the high and clear and the substantial, right? When we're in that middle space, we see both. We don't ignore either one, but somehow we carry both of these things. Then we get to respond skillfully to the world, right? To what's happening here and what's happening out here. We can do that in a skillful, meaningful way. If we can really, really understand that serenity is part of our original nature, because we are already empty of any permanent self-nature, then we don't need to look beyond here and now for opportunities to practice, for opportunities to ardently express our Buddha nature. This is it. Everything we need is right here. So finally, Bokusan says, if we thrust through everything as empty, there is no attachment. So we do not get stuck at the present moment, nor are we stuck with the view of emptiness. So today is today, and we take a steady step with our daily activities. In this way, we are not stuck with the ascent of the real, and we are not stuck with the descent of the phenomenal. This is the middle way. So if we see emptiness, we don't cling to either form or emptiness. We can walk the middle way, which is seeing one reality from two sides, expressing two sides with one action. Here we are again, right? That's the middle ground. So Hongjun was one of our Chinese ancestors. So again, predates Dogen. He says, arising and perishing, coming and going, in motion and calm, emerging and sinking, right at this time, gather up the functional essence of all these many activities. Letting go and grasping are entirely up to myself. So how we carry these things, we get to choose, right? We have some ability to decide. How is that going to go? So it's a great description, I think, of how we practice standing up right in the middle of this intersection of tranquility and movement, or stillness and activity. If we're stuck, he says, there's something we can do about that. That's not the universe handing us something that we can't escape from, right? That's not, I'm in these terrible circumstances and there's nothing I can do. He says, grasping or letting go is up to me. So I can cling to form, I can cling to emptiness, sameness, difference, stillness, activity. But if I do that, I need to recognize I can do something else. I can make a choice to do something else. So in fact, we are the only ones who can unstick ourselves, right? Nobody else can get us unstuck. It's entirely up to us to see that we're clinging, to see that we're stuck, to see that we've achieved some state that we don't want to let go of, or that there's something maybe we need to understand and we're not quite willing to go there. All of that is up to us. So that's both scary and liberating, right? Some days that feels scary and some days that feels liberating. So that means it's our responsibility, but it also means we don't have to wait for anything. So again, we're not waiting for perfect conditions. We're not waiting for perfect stillness. We're not waiting for skillful activity. We don't have to wait for something. We can decide. We can stand up in that intersection right now and ardently express our Buddha nature, as Dogen says. So some days it might feel like we are just too scattered to be exhibiting any kind of Buddha nature. Today there is just sort of no Buddha nature, equanimity, balance at all. We're feeling distracted, we're feeling scattered, we're feeling like the rug's been pulled out. Life circumstances might be more difficult than usual. I'm making a lot of mistakes. I'm feeling distracted. I'm bouncing around. My activity doesn't feel like it's connected to stillness in any way. It just feels like everything is shaking. Everything is agitated. It can be hard to believe that, emptiness and awakening are anywhere, anywhere here. Anywhere in my heart or mind or experience or understanding. So one of the common images in our tradition is about the moon being reflected in water. And Dogen says things like, although golden waves are not calm, the moon lodges in the river. So, this is a not uncommon image for us. There's a moon, usually has some connection with awakening, Buddha nature, reality, something, reflected in water. So whether or not the water is disturbed, whether or not there are waves on the surface of the water, either they're little waves or choppy waves, or maybe that pond, that body of water is completely still, somehow still the moon gets reflected. So these things are never disconnected, right? Of course, it's a metaphor that says that awakening and Buddha nature are still there, no matter how fast we're moving, no matter how choppy we feel, no matter how agitated those waves are, somehow Buddha nature and awakening are still there, still being reflected in the water. So Dogen wrote his own poem about this. There are various poems, but Dogen wrote his own poem about this. And in more modern times, when we started our hymn singing tradition, which was about 70 years ago now in Soto Zen, this poem was set to music. It became part of our repertoire. It's one of the early songs that we learn when we're studying Baika, or studying our hymn singing tradition. So in the Japanese, it goes, Nigori naki kokoro no mizu ni sumutsuki wa kokoro kara koso nami mo kurakete hikari tozo naru, which in English is, being illuminated by the moon, dwelling in the mind water without cloudiness, even the waves are breaking down and becoming the light. So there's an image here of perhaps waves breaking on the shore, right? When waves break, the water kind of... Even in that circumstance, all those little droplets are still reflecting the moon. So no matter how agitated, no matter how much movement is going on, Buddha nature, awakening, not separate from the movement of our lives. So he's telling us that even when the winds of ignorance and delusion and distraction are blowing and creating those waves on the water, even those waves aren't separate from the moon or separate from awakening. So our Zazen is not about trying to make the wind and the waves kind of stop, so that we somehow can ardently express our Buddha nature, because we know in Zazen, thinking doesn't stop. Thinking can't stop, because our karma is still unfolding. So thoughts are going to come up. It's not a question of becoming dead trees, becoming blocks of stone that don't think, don't move, right? Not possible in this human form. And yet, even with that going on, even with thoughts arising, letting go of thought, taking the posture, keeping the eyes open, breathing through the nose, somehow awakening is already there. So there's not something we're traveling toward or trying to grasp. Sometimes Hojo-san talks about becoming one piece. Maybe you've heard in some of his lectures, sometimes he talks about becoming one piece. So when we clearly see both form and emptiness, and we can also go beyond a distinction between form and emptiness, we let go of separation, he says we become one piece, right? That's our stillness in action is like that too. So as soon as we've got separation in our hearts and minds, that gets reflected in the way we go among alien beings. We go among beings who are not like ourselves or who are not ourselves. So we're more likely to get thrown around by what we encounter in the world, whether that's people or circumstances or events or something. We're just more likely to get tossed around by that. So Hojo-san says, this serenity does not simply mean silent or without noise in the external world. When our mind is torn into two or more pieces, there are always dispute, conflict, or anxiety. Such conditions make our mind unsettled and agitated. More often, when we sit in the quiet zendo, we begin to hear the noise from inside. Our zazen of letting go of thoughts allows us to sit immovably without being pulled by those conditions. So when our minds are in pieces, he says, there's always dispute, conflict, or anxiety. Boy, doesn't that feel right. If we've got things kind of pulling us in many directions, and the heart and mind feel like they're in pieces. Wow, there's conflict and anxiety here, and you got to know that's reflected in the way we move through the world. How can we expect to go through the day, meeting people with various points of view, various value systems, interests, whatever, expectations maybe? How can we possibly expect to navigate that as one piece? We're unsettled. The stillness, we kind of lost track of the stillness. There's a lot of activity. There's not so much stillness, right? So, like, how do we sit and become one piece without ignoring anything that's going on out here, without ignoring anything that's happening here, somehow bringing that together, standing up in that intersection? So there's external noise and there's internal noise. There's just a lot of noise some days, right? There's rough edges in the world that we encounter. We've got our own rough edges. We can cut ourselves, and we can cut others on those rough edges. So, like, how do we smooth down the rough edges? I think that's what this gate is about. So, letting go of the stuff that sharpens those rough edges and makes them hard and makes them brittle and makes them sharp and immovable, inflexible, right? So when we eliminate the rough edges, according to this gate, then we've already managed our conduct. We've already done what's necessary to move ourselves and all beings towards liberation from suffering. Simply by finding that middle ground, finding that middle way, standing up in the intersection there between stillness and activity. So what would you like to say this morning about any of that? Stillness and activity, managing our rough edges, how do we meet the world? Don't forget to unmute yourself so we can hear you, and let's hear what others have to say. Mark's already got something to say.
Could you repeat the gate, please?
Repeat the gate. Yes, I will. I should have done it before this. Now I have to get back to the right page. So, gate statement says, entrustment, as a part of the state of truth, is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it conduct is already managed.
Thank you.
So, smoothing our rough edges maybe is a part of the gate of the state of the truth, because then we've already done what we need to liberate ourselves and other beings. That's a paraphrase.
Well, we're talking, in one of the sections you're talking about, in all the sections, I actually have things to talk about, but in one of the sections of, bringing the calmness to, walking through the zendo, in a hurry, not in a hurried state, but still calmly walking. One of the things we do here is we clean, and we don't clean to make it clean. We clean the zendo just to clean. It's part of our practice. And one of the things I notice is that when I sweep, my sweeping reflects my state of mind. I hear people, you're supposed to put the incense in the burner, you put it in straight. If you don't put it in straight, it's like it reflects your state of mind. My sweeping reflects my state of mind. So if I'm distracted thinking, trying to make it clean, my broom keeps hitting the sides of things, right? The same goes with cleaning your cushion. When you clean your cushion, if you hear the swap, 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 sweep, 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 sweep with your hand, is that being calm? Is that reflecting the zazen that you've just sat? Yes, it is. So one of the interesting things I've come to realize over the years is that it's, one of the things I tell people when for the beginning, intro to zazen, I tell them, you sit with your mudra, your clasp, right hand, left hand on top, thumbs lightly touching. Why? Thumbs lightly touching, it's that check engine light for you. If they're kind of askew or off, you're lost in thought. That noise, the noise that you hear when you clean, when you swipe, when you clean your cushion, when you sweep the floor, the crooked incense, that's your check engine light. And it's that continual circumstances that life gives you for you to look at and to return back to life itself. So it's you, the individual, returning to the universe as the universe returns itself to you. So back and forth, back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
So the calmness is there. It's just, you have to listen to it.
You do. Well, and our tradition has so many opportunities to pay attention to things like how we make noise. And it's something that we don't always talk about directly, but so many of the forms that we use in the zendo or for formal meals or for lots of things, if we want to, we can really make it a practice of listening for noise. So when we're doing a formal meal with oryoki, I always know when there's a lot of beginners in the room, because when it comes time to, eating the last bits of the food or scraping the bowl, it's like clack, 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 clack. Just, no. It's, we're supposed to handle, and these are like plastic, sometimes plastic or lacquer bowls, so they're loud, right? It's like, no. We're supposed to handle things carefully and eat in such a way that we're not making lots of noise, Even if we're cooking a meal in the kitchen, for sesshin or even at home, it's like, how much noise are we making? Because are we really paying attention to, are we banging the pots around? Are we setting them carefully? The challenge is, of course, not to become precious about this. Because I think, for instance, paying attention to how much noise we make when we're sweeping, does the broom hit the sides of the tatami, I think is a wonderful practice. And we can't get precious about, I must be absolutely, because that becomes an ego trip. I must do this absolutely perfectly. That's a real intersection. That's a really challenging intersection to be in. I need to do things carefully, pay attention to what I'm doing, but it can't be about me, right? I can't get precious about what I'm doing. So yes, we carry things in a certain way. We use our utensils, our artifacts in a certain way. It's a wonderful practice. And it's so easy to flop over. So I think, as Mark says, to be right in the middle of that, is the incense exactly straight, is a wonderful practice. So before we jump back to you, because I know you've got more things to say, things from anybody at home or Hoshin or anybody else? Comments, questions? Jeff, please.
I have two questions that I think are quick. When you were quoting Hojo-san and speaking about being one piece, that's PEA?
No, one piece, two pieces.
That was what I first thought, and then I started to.
It's not a play on words, although that's interesting, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. That was one. The other was a couple of times you quoted some of the writing about attaining I think you were saying attaining a place between stillness and activity and going out into the world of aliens. And every time that you stated that, I heard this such a stark separation that confused me. And
it's interesting, isn't it, that that's the word that got. Now, I haven't looked at. I don't think I have the Japanese for that, so I didn't look up like what kanji is that really. So I think he's trying to make the point that we're going out amongst people who have characteristics which are different from ourselves. In other words, there is difference. So if we're going to bring together difference and sameness, right, like the Sandokai, so there is difference. People have different worldviews, there are different experiences and whatever. And yet, so how do we go amongst people who are different from ourselves and yet not have separation? So I think he's trying to make he's trying to make a distinction and say there's form and emptiness. So I think he's saying in the world of form, people are different. Things are different, there's difference. Why the word aliens, I don't know. I think I wish I could have investigated that. I don't have the kanji for it. Maybe I'll try to find it. So, put your own word in there. But I think the teaching there is, difference and sameness, form and emptiness. How do we go amongst people who we may find challenging, who may be different from ourselves, and yet one piece? So, yeah, I think it's a startling word. I agree with you. I think it's a startling word. Do you want to follow up on anything there?
Yeah, I think, well, then just was an observation that I wanted to, or a memory that I wanted to share. Is that many years ago, I was did a whole series of taking. I wasn't studying, but worked with the guy in ceramics, learning to throw pots, and he was telling a story about training in Japan, where apparently you would spend 6 months learning to center. lump of clay on a wheel without ever raising a pot. And according to his story, you would do this until the clay, when it was on the spinning wheel, looked like it was standing still. And when you stopped it, it would look like it was turning. And it was that. So there was a wonderful metaphor at the time, and also kind of a direct reality when you were talking about stillness and activity. That image came back. So I thought I'd share that one.
That's a great picture. I think that's a great description of what's going on. And I got to say, I'm not surprised. 6 months simply to center the clay, not surprised at all. That sounds so much like what we might call Zen arts, and maybe Hoshin has something to say about that, right? It's like, yeah, you spend 6 months just getting yourself in the place where you can, where I think as Hoshin would say, you leave the art studio. Clay is being thrown, but you're not doing it. Pottery is happening, but you're not doing it, right? Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think if we can do that, we're certainly standing in that intersection. And if you see somebody who's really good at something like that, getting clay on a wheel, throwing darts, whatever the thing is, it's like you see somebody who's really standing in that intersection. I always thought it was really interesting. One of the years when I was watching Olympics, and they have the event where people are cross-country skiing and then they have to shoot targets. I don't remember what you call that. And one of the real challenges is you're skiing hard because it's a race. And then you've got to drop down on the ground and be steady enough, control yourself enough, be still enough to pick off these targets. I just thought, wow, that is a practice. You can only control so much. Your body needs oxygen, right? And yet you have to get yourself to a mental and physical stillness long enough to shoot those targets. I thought that's an interesting intersection. What would others like to say? Stillness and activity, calm amidst the storm. Hoshin, please.
In here. I haven't fully formed this question yet or comment, but a phrase I had come across years ago, and when I was first starting to practice, was mundane is most profound. And so I've been, over the years, it just pops into my head, and I'm thinking about what it really means, because it kind of doesn't seem like these should go together. However, if we practice Zazen like we practice our lives, like we try and practice Zazen or Buddhism, the mundane and the what would be the opposite of that? The
exalted.
Yes. There's no difference there. Mm-hmm. And anyway, I put that out there. Maybe you can riff on it. Yeah.
So of course, mundane is most profound. My question is, where is the separation? Well, I'm not questioning you. I'm just saying, when I hear that, I think, okay, the teaching there is to decide that something is mundane and something is profound is my decision, right? That's not the nature of reality. That's me making a separation. So I can decide this thing is boring, dull, meaningless, uninteresting, and this thing is somehow sexy and powerful and wonderful and beautiful, and I want. So it's very much, I think, about chasing and escaping. But if we can do the mundane thing, if we can sweep the floor without hitting the tatami, if we can eat the food without banging the utensils, those are mundane activities. And yet, to do those things with Zazen mind, to do those things as a complete expression of Buddha nature, what is more profound than that? Someday I want to do a talk on, Sawaki Roshi used a term, I think it was yusui, subtle and profound. And he described things like Zazen mind, is subtle and profound. It's like there's no end to it. Where is the outside border of Zazen mind? Profound, wow, and yet subtle. And so there's so much in the Japanese culture anyway, but just certainly in our practice about simple things. And yet, here's form and here's emptiness. And where's the edge of that? Here's mundane, and here's also profound. Where's the edge of that? And again, I think we have to be careful not to get precious. Because when we begin this practice and we hear things, we hear teachings like that, then, oh my goodness, the stones on the path become, shining jewels, and we want to really, and that's again about, here's my idea about, I'm looking for something. I want to find a profundity in this, because somehow the fact that this is a mundane form isn't enough. Right? The fact that this is a simple object somehow isn't enough. In order for it to be valuable, it also has to be profound. Well, this is all just my idea. It's enough that this is what it is. It's enough that this is mundane. I don't need to do anything with that. It's because I want something out of that relationship, that I want to, this is a profound thing. Eating my food is just this profound act. Well, it is, but as Dogen would say, because it's a profound act, we don't have to say so. As soon as we say so, we're not one piece. To simply encounter things without separation is to not make that distinction, not even to value that there's, profundity in the mundane, not even to value that there's emptiness in form. So this is what we're saying. We're saying when there's form and emptiness, we go beyond that. We let go of the idea that we have to look for something in that. It is simply okay as it is, right? So those teachings are, I think, helpful to recognize this is not just an object. There is emptiness here. But then how do we let go of the fact that there's emptiness here? There's always another layer to peel off that onion, right? This practice goes on forever. Bodhisattva vows, we never get to the end, right? Because there's always one more little place that we get stuck. In the beginning of our practice, we get stuck on the big, coarse, gross stuff. And then the more we practice, it's like, there's this other little bit of attachment here. I can let go of that too, right? Zazen. Zazen never ends. What else would people like to say this morning? Anything from folks at home before I give Mark one more chance? He's laughing. All right, you got one more for us here, Mark?
Yes, I do.
All right. I know you do.
So when we're talking about calmness, going about our day, there was something that came to mind actually. Ryomonji, Dragon's Gate Temple, and Doju just had a Soshu ceremony, Hosenshiki there, and I was curious why Dragon's Gate, because there was some reference in his questioning. And this applies to what we're talking about in calmness. It's a name from their website. It says it's an ancient name that comes from the Chinese legend. The legend is that there is a gate in the ocean where huge waves repeatedly rise. The fish that can pass through the waves of this gate become dragons. Dragons are mythological characters that represent qualities of great strength and compassion. The waves, there are no different than the waves anywhere else. The waves of everyday life are the Dragon's Gate. How we pass through the waves is our own human challenge. And I found that interesting is that it's everything that we do in our day-to-day life. There is inherently in that day-to-day life that calmness. This, you're talking about how this zendo has been so noisy. I find it to be both one of the most quietest zendos I've ever sat in, but also one of the most noisiest. It's extremely quiet in that you're not at a street corner, you're not near downtown San Francisco, and you're not in some secluded wood where you get to hear the birds singing their little hearts out, which is actually surprisingly a lot louder than you really think. But there's still, so there is that stillness there here at the zendo, but there's still also the slippers coming down the hallway, the thud of the coffee cup, the garbage trucks backing up on Tuesday morning at about 6:50. All of that, it seems rather noisy, but it's not. It's the stillness that is present within the coffee, within the slipper, within the garbage. And even in contrast, even with the birds singing the little hearts out. So I find that legend and just the gate itself to be quite fascinating, and to bring that in with the Dharma talk today, to be quite encouraging with our practice.
Yeah, I think so. Ryumonji is a place in Iowa. It's built on the plans of Shogoji in Japan, because that's where one of the places the founder trained for a long time. So this is where, as Mark says, our friend Doju just did his Shuso ceremony, his Hosenshiki. So it's built on a rather traditional kind of model. And so yes, they named this thing Ryumonji, which is the Dragon Gate Temple. So hearing that legend again is helpful, right? You know, when the fish go through that gate, they become dragons. Well, so they move from something we could call mundane to something we could call profound, right? Here's these little goldfish or little, sea bream or whatever they are, and they go through the gate, and suddenly, they become dragons. So I think it's useful to recognize, yes, the gate is the temple gate, but the gate is also our daily activity. If we can navigate those waves, not being separate from them, not being thrown around by them, that is a real ground of practice. I think it's not a coincidence, of course, that, at least in the Japanese parts of our tradition, waves are an important image, because, Japan is an island, right? If there was going to be something which was churning, it was going to be waves and hurricanes and typhoons, and, that was going to be kind of a important image. So I guess I'm not surprised, although Dragon Gate may come from China and not from Japan. I guess I'm not surprised that this churning water is kind of an important symbol, right? So as I say, one of the first songs that we learn in the Baika repertoire has to do with the waves, reflecting off of this. The moon reflecting off of these waves, the light reflecting off the waves. So we are certainly thrown waves of various kinds in our life. Sometimes those waves are outside. We say, well, that's an outside circumstance. And sometimes those waves are simply our day-to-day activity. It's the getting up off the cushion. It's the hearing the slippers down the stairs, all of those things. When we go through those and we navigate those, Buddha nature is there. Dragon is already there. So yeah, in a way, there's no escape, but also there's no, we have so many opportunities to practice, we can feel grateful. If we can find all of those little gates, all of those little waves, we can be grateful for many opportunities to practice. Anything else people would like to say today? Everyone good for now? We've been still enough. We're going to get up and go out and do some activity. All right. So let's do our closing chant, and we'll do some bows, and then we'll hear some announcements. And thank you for your practice today. We will see you next time.